There was a time when humans were terrified of something that follows every one of us today. It didn't have teeth. It didn't make a sound. It never attacked anyone. Yet thousands of years ago, people genuinely believed it could be a sign of danger, or even death. That thing was their own shadow. It sounds impossible now because we understand how light works. But if you lived during the Stone Age, long before science existed, your shadow would have been one of the strangest things you had ever seen. It appeared without warning, changed its shape every hour, disappeared for no reason, and at night, around a flickering fire, it almost looked alive. The real question isn't why ancient humans feared their shadows. It's why they wouldn't have. Picture a small tribe living nearly 50,000 years ago. The sun has already disappeared behind the mountains, and the forest is slowly becoming silent. A few hunters have just returned after an exhausting day. Children sit close to the fire while the elders prepare food. Everything feels calm. Then the flames suddenly flicker because of a cold gust of wind. In a single moment, every shadow inside the cave stretches across the walls. One hunter suddenly looks twice his normal height. Another appears to have giant claws. A child watches the wall in complete shock because, for a split second, it looks as if another creature has entered the cave. Nobody understands what is happening. Nobody knows that it's only light. All they know is that something impossible has appeared. To us, this seems obvious. We learn about shadows as children. But ancient humans had no teachers, no books, no science, and no explanation. Every strange event had to be understood through experience alone. Their entire world was built on observation. If something unusual happened, it usually happened for a reason. A strange footprint meant an animal had passed by. Broken branches meant something large had moved through the forest. Silence often meant a predator was nearby. Their brains were trained to believe that unusual things were warnings, not coincidences. So when their own shadow suddenly changed shape without any visible reason, their survival instincts immediately treated it as something important. This wasn't because they were foolish. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. The human brain evolved to react before thinking. Imagine hearing a loud sound in the bushes while walking through a forest. If you stopped to carefully analyze every possibility, you might already be too late. But if your brain instantly assumes danger and makes you step back, you survive more often. Evolution rewarded people who reacted quickly, even if they were wrong sometimes. Over thousands of generations, this instinct became deeply wired into the human mind. That's why our brains still notice movement in the corner of our vision before we consciously understand what we saw. Shadows became trapped inside this survival system. They moved when humans moved, but not always in ways that made sense. During sunrise and sunset, they became unbelievably long. At noon, they almost disappeared beneath your feet. Around a campfire, they danced across cave walls in impossible shapes. Every single change happened without warning. Ancient humans couldn't predict it because they didn't understand the relationship between light and objects. From their perspective, shadows behaved almost like living creatures. Things became even stranger after dark. Fire was one of humanity's greatest discoveries. It scared predators away, kept people warm, and allowed families to stay awake long after sunset. But fire also introduced a completely new experience. Unlike sunlight, firelight never stays still. Every tiny movement of the flames changes the direction of the light. That means every shadow constantly changes shape. 1 second your hand looks normal. The next second its shadow becomes enormous. Someone leans forward, and suddenly a giant figure appears across the cave wall. A child raises a stick, and its shadow transforms into something that resembles a spear or a claw. These weren't just visual tricks. They were experiences that the human brain had never evolved to explain. Modern neuroscience tells us something fascinating. Whenever the brain receives incomplete information, it automatically fills in the missing pieces using memory, emotion, and past experience. This process is called predictive perception. In simple words, your brain guesses what's happening before it actually knows. Most of the time, those guesses are incredibly accurate. But in darkness, where information is limited, those guesses become much less reliable. Instead of seeing exactly what's there, the brain begins imagining possibilities. That's why even today, people often mistake a hanging jacket for a person standing in the room. It's why a tree outside a window can briefly look like someone watching you. Your brain would rather make a false alarm than ignore a real threat. Ancient humans experienced this effect every single night. The darker the environment became, the harder it was to separate reality from imagination. A shadow wasn't just a shadow anymore. It became a question. And unanswered questions are exactly where fear begins. As generations passed, these experiences slowly transformed into stories. Parents warned children not to wander too far from the fire after sunset. Elders spoke about mysterious figures hidden in darkness. Some believed shadows carried part of a person's spirit. Others believed strange shadows were warnings from unseen forces. Nobody invented these stories just to entertain people. They were survival lessons wrapped inside mythology. Whether the explanation was true or not didn't really matter. The important thing was that people stayed alert, stayed together, and avoided unnecessary risks after dark. But here's the most surprising part. The shadow itself was never the real enemy. The real enemy was something far more powerful. Something every human still carries inside their head today. It was the ancient survival system of the human brain, a system that could turn an ordinary shadow into a deadly warning in less than a second. And once scientists finally understood how that system worked, they discovered something astonishing. Even in the modern world, your brain still reacts exactly the same way. The strange thing is, ancient humans weren't the only ones who feared shadows. Even today, your brain reacts to them before you even realize it. Walk through your house in complete darkness, and let a shadow suddenly move across the wall. For a split second, your heart will beat faster. You already know it's probably nothing, yet your body still prepares for danger. That reaction isn't irrational. It's ancient. It's a survival system that has been protecting humans for tens of thousands of years. Scientists call this the hyperactive agency detection system. It sounds complicated, but the idea is surprisingly simple. Whenever your brain notices something unusual, it immediately assumes that another living creature might be responsible. This system evolved because making 100 false alarms was far safer than missing one real predator. Imagine hearing leaves rustling behind you in the Stone Age. If it was only the wind, nothing happened. But if it was a hungry leopard and you ignored it, your story ended there. Evolution rewarded cautious people, not fearless ones. Now place that same brain inside a dark prehistoric cave. The only source of light is a small fire burning in the middle of the tribe. The flames never stay still. Every few seconds they dance, sending strange shadows racing across the cave walls. A hunter stands up, and his shadow suddenly grows into a giant figure stretching toward the ceiling. Another person bends down, and the shadow twists into something that no longer looks human. A child watching this doesn't understand perspective or moving light. All the child sees is a world where people seem to transform into monsters without warning. Over hundreds of generations, experiences like these slowly became stories. Every tribe had its own version. Some believed shadows were silent spirits that copied every movement. Others believed a person's shadow carried part of their soul. A few even warned that stepping on another person's shadow could bring bad luck or weaken their spirit. These beliefs may sound strange today, but they all came from the same place: the human need to explain things that couldn't yet be understood. The fascinating part is that these stories actually served a purpose. They kept people careful after sunset. Children stayed close to the fire instead of wandering into the darkness. Hunters remained alert instead of becoming careless. Entire tribes survived because fear encouraged caution. Even when the explanation wasn't scientifically correct, the behavior it created often increased the tribe's chances of survival. Then there was another terrifying discovery. Ancient humans noticed that shadows didn't always behave the same way. During sunrise, they stretched endlessly across the ground. At midday, they almost disappeared. At sunset, they became even longer than before. Nobody understood that the sun's position was changing. To them, it looked as if the shadow itself had a life of its own. Imagine seeing your own shadow become 5 times taller than your body within just a few hours. Without science, wouldn't you start asking questions too? Things became even more frightening during unusual natural events. A solar eclipse could suddenly darken the land in the middle of the day. The bright world became dim, strange shadows appeared everywhere. Birds stopped singing, and animals behaved differently. Ancient humans had never seen anything like it. They didn't know the moon was passing in front of the sun. All they knew was that the sky had changed without warning. For many tribes, it felt like the entire world was giving them a sign. This is where mythology truly began. Humans are natural storytellers. Whenever the brain cannot find an answer, it creates one. Those explanations slowly turned into legends passed from one generation to another. That's why so many ancient civilizations, even those separated by thousands of kilometers, developed remarkably similar stories about darkness, shadows, spirits, and unseen forces. They weren't copying each other. They were responding to the same human emotions. Modern psychology has revealed something remarkable. Fear becomes much stronger when the danger is unclear. If you clearly see a wolf standing 20 meters away, your brain immediately begins planning how to escape. But if you only see a strange moving shadow, your imagination starts creating countless possibilities. The unknown is often more frightening than the truth itself. That's exactly why horror movies rarely show the monster at the beginning. Instead, they show its shadow, its silhouette, or a movement in the darkness. Filmmakers are using the very same psychological instincts that once kept ancient humans alive. But despite all this fear, something extraordinary slowly happened. Humans stopped seeing shadows only as warnings. They began using them. Around campfires, children discovered they could make animal shapes with their hands. Hunters used shadows to entertain their families after long days. Storytellers realized they could create moving figures on cave walls simply by changing the position of the fire. Without realizing it, they had invented one of the earliest forms of visual storytelling in human history. The very thing that once terrified humanity was slowly becoming a tool for creativity. Fear was beginning to transform into curiosity, and that change would eventually lead humans toward art, science, and discovery. But before shadows became a source of imagination, they first had to survive the greatest illusion the human mind had ever created. And that illusion still affects every one of us today. As generations passed, something incredible began to happen. Humans slowly stopped seeing shadows as mysterious enemies and started seeing them as clues. Instead of asking, "What is that dark figure?" they began asking, "Why does it move like that?" That single change in thinking became one of the biggest turning points in human history. Fear slowly gave way to curiosity, and curiosity eventually became knowledge. The very thing that once terrified entire tribes would later help humans understand time, seasons, and even the movement of the sun itself. Imagine an ancient hunter sitting outside his cave just before sunset. Day after day, he notices that his shadow always becomes longer as the sun gets lower. First, it seems random, but after weeks of careful observation, he realizes it happens every single evening. For the first time, a shadow is no longer a warning. It's a pattern. And once humans began recognizing patterns instead of fearing them, civilization quietly took its first steps forward. Thousands of years later, ancient civilizations would use shadows to create the world's first sundials. Farmers learned to estimate the time of day simply by watching where a shadow fell on the ground. Builders used sunlight and shadows to align massive structures with incredible precision. Something that once represented fear had become one of humanity's earliest scientific tools. The shadow itself never changed. Human understanding did. But here's the fascinating part. Even though science eventually explained shadows, the ancient survival system inside our brains never disappeared. Modern neuroscientists believe the basic structure of the human brain has changed very little over the last 40,000 years. That means the same instincts that protected prehistoric hunters are still active inside you today. Have you ever walked through a dark hallway and thought someone was standing at the end, only to realize it was a jacket hanging on a chair? Or noticed movement in the corner of your eye that turned out to be nothing more than a shadow? For a split second, your heart still beats faster. That's not because you're irrational. It's because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do: detect possible danger before it's too late. This is why horror movies are so effective. Directors rarely reveal the monster immediately. Instead, they show a shadow moving across the wall, a silhouette standing in a doorway, or a figure hidden behind weak light. They understand something filmmakers and psychologists both know. The human imagination is often far more terrifying than reality. When the brain doesn't have enough information, it fills in the missing pieces itself, and it almost always imagines the worst. Ancient humans experienced this feeling every single night. Darkness limited what they could see, while flickering firelight constantly changed the shadows around them. Their brains naturally assumed that unusual movement might mean danger. Most of the time they were wrong, but the few times they were right made all the difference. Evolution rewarded caution because cautious people survived long enough to pass those instincts to the next generation. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this story. Ancient humans weren't weak. They weren't foolish. They were adapting to one of the most dangerous environments our species has ever faced. Their fear of shadows wasn't a mistake, it was a survival strategy built from thousands of years of experience. And without those instincts, humanity might never have survived long enough to build the civilizations we live in today. The next time you notice your shadow stretching across the ground at sunset, remember that you're looking at exactly the same phenomenon your ancestors watched tens of thousands of years ago. They saw mystery. You see science. They saw uncertainty. You see light. But both of you are looking at the same shadow under the same sun. In the end, ancient humans didn't fear shadows because they believed every shadow was a monster. They feared what they couldn't explain. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Every great discovery in history began when someone stopped running from the unknown and started asking questions instead. So the next time your shadow catches your attention for just a second, remember this. Deep inside your mind, a tiny part of your Stone Age ancestor is still alive, quietly reminding you to stay alert. Because thousands of years ago, that simple instinct didn't just protect a single person. It helped protect the future of the entire human race.